My name is Jax Mercer. I'm 38 years old, and I was handed a $3 million check to sign away my rights to my family, only to realize the man who drafted the agreement, the family's trusted attorney Caleb Novak, was the one who had spent the last year secretly fathering the twins my wife claimed were a miracle. The DNA results arrived on the morning of my ex-wife's wedding in Charlotte, North Carolina. I wasn't there to see the flowers or the white silk runners or the way the light hit the stained glass of the chapel. I was sitting alone at a small table near the window of a quiet hotel room in Uptown, watching steam rise from a paper cup of Starbucks coffee that had already gone cold. My phone lit up face down on the faux marble desk, vibrating like something alive, something impatient that didn't care about the silence I was trying to preserve. I didn't answer it because I already knew what the call would sound like. It would be panic dressed up as politeness and fear pretending to be control. 3 weeks earlier, I had smiled and signed the divorce papers in a room that smelled of expensive leather and old money. And everyone in that room believed the story was over. They believed that for $3 million, a senior architect like me would simply evaporate into the Carolina heat and never look back. They were wrong. I need to ask you something first. Where are you listening to this story from today? Because what I'm about to tell you, I have never shared with anyone. I remember thinking that morning that the hardest part was already behind us. I stood in our kitchen looking at the way the light caught the brushed nickel fixtures, and I honestly believed that my wife and I were finally on the same page. The night it all began, my wife, Sophia Reed, a woman I had spent 12 years building a life with, kissed my forehead the way she always did when she wanted to appear gentle without actually committing to closeness. Her lips were cool, almost clinical. Her perfume, something clean and designer, hung in the air between us like a physical barrier I couldn't quite push through. "We're going to be fine, babe," she said softly, her voice steady enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking for the cracks. The dishwasher hummed behind her, a domestic, comforting sound that felt like a lie in the moment. The kitchen lights were too bright for that hour, bouncing off the white marble countertops we'd picked together 3 years ago during a weekend trip to Atlanta. I nodded because nodding was easier than asking the questions I already knew the answers to, and 5 minutes later, my phone rang. It was my mother-in-law, Eleanor Reed. She sounded too cheerful, the way people sound when they're about to negotiate something ugly and want to make sure you're off balance before the first blow lands. "My name is Eleanor," she didn't need to say, but her presence filled the line with the weight of the Reed family legacy. She asked if I could come by the house in Myers Park because we needed to talk that night. My wife didn't ask who it was, she already knew, and she was already reaching for her trench coat, her movements efficient and rehearsed. That was when I understood this wasn't a conversation we were going to have as a couple. It was a script, and I had somehow missed every single rehearsal. Her parents' house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac where the willow oaks were trimmed weekly and the neighbors waved without ever really looking at you. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lemon polish and the kind of quiet that only comes with significant generational wealth. There was art on the walls that wasn't there to be enjoyed, only displayed like trophies of a life I had never fully been allowed to join. A low table was already set with crystal glasses we hadn't asked for, and my father-in-law sat rigid on the velvet couch while my mother-in-law stood by the stone fireplace. Beside them, as if summoned from a corporate legal thriller, was a man in a charcoal gray suit I recognized immediately. Caleb Novak, the managing partner of the most powerful estate law firm in the Southeast. "Let's be practical," my mother-in-law said before I'd even found a place to sit. An envelope slid across the table toward me, thick, cream-colored, and heavy with the weight of a finished marriage. Inside it was a single page with a number printed so neatly it almost felt polite. $3 million for me to sign the divorce papers that night. She continued as if she were explaining the warranty on a new luxury SUV, telling me it was time to move on with my life and leave the Reed name behind. My wife stood near the window with her back to me, staring out at the dark street like it had answers she didn't want to hear, and I didn't ask why. I didn't ask how long the affair had been going on, or who the other man was, because betrayal rarely arrives all at once in a Southern family like theirs. It comes in fragments, a banking password changed here, a late meeting in Raleigh there, and a look that passes through you instead of landing on you. "What about the other part?" I asked, my voice coming out calmer than I felt. My mother-in-law tilted her head, looking genuinely confused for a split second. "The truth," I said. Silence followed, the kind of silence that hums louder than any conversation. My father-in-law cleared his throat, muttering that this was best for everyone involved, but I just looked at the woman I had married. She didn't look back. That was the moment something inside me went quiet. Not broken, just quiet, like a room after all the furniture has been removed. I smiled and offered my congratulations on the new chapter they were so careful not to include me in. The baby, the wedding to Owen Hale, and the life they had built on top of my shadow. Caleb Novak slid a leather folder toward me containing the divorce papers, an NDA, and a confidentiality clause wide enough to silence a lifetime. "Sign here," the lawyer said smoothly, his voice like silk. I picked up the pen and paused, demanding the papers be notarized and filed at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse with the wire transfer hitting my account that night. My mother-in-law smiled, relieved because she thought she'd won. They thought I was focused on the money, but they didn't understand that in my world of architecture and structural integrity, money leaves digital footprints, and footprints always tell a story. At the courthouse, the air smelled like old paper and cold industrial air conditioning. I signed the documents without a single tremor in my hand, while my wife's hand shook so hard she almost tore the page. The money hit my Wells Fargo account before I even left the building, and I saved the receipt, the screenshot, and the email confirmation in 3 different cloud backups. It wasn't fear, it was habit. When I got home that night to pack my things for the last time, I did it slowly, not out of heartbreak, but out of a sudden, chilling clarity. At the bottom of a walnut dresser drawer beneath some old insurance documents, I found a thin medical file from a fertility specialist in Raleigh we had seen years ago. "Low probability of conception," the doctor had told us then. "Possible, but highly unlikely without significant intervention." I sat on the edge of the bed, the room smelling of lavender detergent and the looming end of my identity. My phone buzzed with a text from the woman I was no longer married to, saying she hoped I was okay. I didn't respond. Instead, I stared at that medical file and felt a new kind of focus settle in my chest. If she was pregnant with twins, and I was the man with the fertility issues, then someone was lying about the biological timeline. I had just been paid $3 million to leave the room before the truth arrived. But as I looked at the lawyer's signature on my divorce decree, I realized the truth was already sitting at the table with us. I didn't leave town because I was running from the Reed family or the shadow of Caleb Novak. I left because distance makes structural patterns visible, and as a senior architect, I knew that when a building is leaning, you have to step back to see which way it's going to fall. 2 days after the Mecklenburg County Courthouse filing, I checked into a Courtyard Marriott just off I-77 on the south side of Charlotte. It was one of those places designed to feel anonymous on purpose: beige walls, muted corporate art, and the low, constant hum of an HVAC unit that never quite shuts off. I placed my Toomey suitcase by the bed, set my keys on the laminate desk, and stood there for a long moment with my hands on my hips, listening to the quiet. It was the first time in over a decade that no one expected me to be anything other than a name on a check-in sheet. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the room's cheap Cuisinart machine. It tasted burnt and metallic, a far cry from the expensive French press my wife used to make every morning in our designer kitchen, but I drank it anyway. In a life that had just been demolished, ritual mattered more than comfort. I opened my MacBook and began doing what I had always done best, organizing information. Divorce filing confirmed. Wells Fargo wire transfer confirmed. Notarized signatures scanned and saved into an encrypted Dropbox folder. I spent an hour highlighting the NDA the lawyer had practically forced into my hand. The language was aggressive, far too aggressive for a simple, amicable split between two people who had just grown apart. It barred me from discussing any matter pertaining to the marriage, its dissolution, or any related medical circumstances. That kind of language wasn't written to protect my wife's feelings or her social standing at the Charlotte Country Club. It was written to protect a reputation that was already rotting from the inside out. I kept going back to the medical file I'd brought from the house. It was from Carolina fertility specialists up in Raleigh, dated 3 years ago. I remember the drive home that day in my Toyota Camry, the silence in the car feeling like a physical weight. My wife had stared out the window at the pines lining I-40, her face a mask of disappointment that she made sure I felt. The doctor had been kind but firm. He told us that for a man with my specific biological markers, natural conception was a 1 in a million shot. I remember thinking that I was the flaw in the blueprints of our family. I spent years carrying that guilt like a stone, apologizing for a body that wouldn't do what it was supposed to do. I think most of us know that feeling, when you've spent years trying to build something that just won't stand, and you start to believe the failure is your own fault. That's what you do when you love someone. You take their heavy lifting and make it your own, even when it starts to crush you. I sat at that hotel desk until the sun started to dip behind the Charlotte skyline, the light turning a bruised purple over the Bank of America Stadium. My phone buzzed with an automated header from an old Gmail account my wife and I had once shared for Blue Cross insurance and household bills. It was a prenatal paternity test appointment confirmation from a private lab in Winston-Salem. I read it twice, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Date scheduled for the previous Wednesday. Results expected by Friday at 10 a.m. I wasn't listed as the patient, and I certainly wasn't listed as the father, but because they hadn't updated the emergency contact info, the digital ghost of our marriage had sent the notification to me. They were in a hurry to confirm the father of the twins before the wedding to Owen Hale. The man my wife was set to marry was a hedge fund manager with a family name that carried almost as much weight as the Reeds. He was the kind of man who wanted a perfect life with a perfect wife and a perfect immediate heir. He was the mirror of everything I had tried to be, but with the financial portfolio to actually pull it off. I stared at the screen and felt a cold, sharp focus. If the Raleigh doctors were right, then the twins weren't mine. And if my wife was rushing a test, she wasn't sure if they were Owen's either. I forwarded the email to Elise Drummond, a senior litigation paralegal I'd known since our days at NC State. She wasn't my lawyer yet, but she had a surgical eye for pressure disguised as a choice. She called me within 30 seconds, her voice coming through the iPhone speaker sharp and without a greeting. "They rushed you, Jax," she said, and I could hear her typing in the background. That's not how a North Carolina divorce looks when things are actually amicable. People only rush when they're afraid of something showing up late to the party. I stared at the beige wallpaper and realized she was right. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Reed, hadn't been buying my silence with that $3 million. She'd been buying time. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the taillights of cars moving along the interstate, a steady stream of people going home to lives that probably made sense. On Instagram, my wife's family was posting photos of white hydrangea samples and venue walkthroughs at the Duke Mansion. The captions were all about new beginnings and how beautiful things grow from the ashes. I didn't feel jealous of the man who was taking my place. I felt replaced, like a house that had been gutted, flipped, and relisted before the previous owner had even found a new place to sleep. My wife was performing a masterpiece of Southern grace, and I was the only one who knew the walls were held up by legal threats and confidentiality agreements. Around midnight, a message came in from a number I didn't recognize. No name, no area code I knew. "You should know they're pushing the DNA results before the wedding on purpose," it read. I typed back, asking who it was, my fingers hovering over the touchscreen. The response was immediate. "Someone who doesn't like being told what to forget." The 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, leaving me in the dark of that Marriott room with nothing but the hum of the AC and the realization that the Reed family wasn't as airtight as they wanted the world to believe. Someone on the inside was starting to crack, and I was the only one holding the bucket to catch the pieces. Friday morning arrived with a stillness that felt heavy, like the air right before a Carolina thunderstorm breaks the heat of the Piedmont. I woke up before my alarm, showered, and dressed in a plain charcoal button-down. The kind of outfit that makes you feel invisible and armored at the same time. I sat at the small table by the window of my hotel room, the same spot where I had spent the last 48 hours dissecting the ruins of my life. I had spent the last hour just watching the way the sunlight crawled across the beige carpet, tracing the patterns of the dust motes as they danced in the air. It was a perfectly ordinary morning, the kind where you could almost believe that life was simple and that people meant exactly what they said. I remember feeling a strange sense of peace, like the world was holding its breath with me, unaware that the foundation was already beginning to crumble. I set my phone face down on the laminate surface beside a fresh cup of coffee. At 9:58 a.m., my hands were steady, a side effect of years spent drawing straight lines and calculating load-bearing weights for skyscrapers in downtown Charlotte. At 10:01, the phone vibrated once, then again. I didn't pick it up. I let the silence of the room absorb the sound, watching the LED light on the edge of the device blink a steady, rhythmic blue. At 10:02, it began to ring. This time I answered. "Jax, my mother-in-law, Eleanor Reed," said. Her voice was breathless, stripped of the polished southern charm she usually wore like a pearl necklace. She was trying to sound composed, but the cracks were wide enough to see through. "Are you somewhere private?" I closed my eyes, leaning back into the stiff hotel chair. "I am," I said, and I didn't ask her what was wrong because I didn't need to. Her breathing told me everything I needed to know. It came in shallow, panicked bursts, like she was standing in a room that had suddenly grown too small for her ego. "There's been a complication," my mother-in-law said carefully, as if choosing the right word might still save the Reed family reputation. I waited, offering her nothing but the hum of the HVAC unit. The results, the DNA test results for the twins. They don't say what we expected. Behind her voice, I could hear movement, the sharp sound of shoes on hardwood, a door opening and closing too hard, and someone crying in a way that sounded like they were trying to swallow their own voice. I sat there thinking, they really don't know. They've spent all this time trying to manage me, trying to pay me to vanish, and they haven't even looked at the man standing in the middle of their own circle. "I see," I said evenly. The silence on the other end stretched, becoming a physical thing. She had expected anger, or perhaps the kind of frantic questioning that would give her back the upper hand. Instead, she got the calm of a man who had already seen the blueprints for the collapse. "Did you know about the test?" she finally asked, her voice tightening with a sudden, desperate suspicion. I looked out the window at the interstate traffic below, watching a silver SUV merge into the fast lane toward Rock Hill. "You and Caleb Novak were in such a hurry to get me out of the picture," I said, making sure my voice didn't rise. "I assumed you'd handle the details of your own secrets." Her breath caught, a sharp, ragged sound. "This isn't the time for that tone, Jax," she snapped, but the authority was gone, replaced by a raw, unadulterated fear. A new voice cut in sharply then, loud enough that I could hear him even though he wasn't holding the phone. It was the man my wife was supposed to marry tomorrow, Owen Hale. "The lab in Winston-Salem screwed up," the groom shouted, his voice echoing off whatever expensive marble walls they were standing within. "That's what these places do. They fail. They lose samples. They make mistakes." I could almost picture him, the hedge fund manager who was used to yelling at trading screens until the numbers did what he wanted. "Tests don't fail like this," I replied, and the line went quiet again. "How would you know?" he snapped, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance that only comes from never being told no. I thought about the medical file in my messenger bag, the one that said my chances of being the father were almost zero. I thought about the fact that if the twins weren't his, and they weren't mine, then the Reed family was about to face a very different kind of structural failure. "If you think the results are wrong, run them again," I said, "but we both know that time isn't on your side with a wedding scheduled for tomorrow morning." A sharp sound followed my words, something being knocked over, a crystal glass or a chair, followed by the cracking voice of the woman who had been my wife. "It's not wrong," she whispered, and the line went dead. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there listening to the distant sound of the city, the muted life happening in the other hotel rooms, and the way the world kept turning even when a 12-year lie finally hits the ground. 10 minutes later, my friend and paralegal, Elise Drummond, called. "They got the results," she said without needing to ask. "So I've heard," I replied, rubbing my temples. "And?" she asked. "And the whole house of cards is shaking," I said. "They're not done, Jax. People like Eleanor Reed and Caleb Novak don't just lose, they switch tactics. They're going to try to find someone to blame, and right now, you're the easiest target they have." That afternoon, I checked out of the Marriott and drove south, away from the Myers Park mansions and the corporate offices. I didn't go home. I didn't have a home anymore. I drove until the Charlotte skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror, heading toward a small coastal town near Wilmington. I needed somewhere neutral, somewhere where the air smelled of salt and the horizon didn't end in someone else's expectations. I booked a room at a small inn with creaky oak floors and a view of the Atlantic, the kind of place people go when they want to think without being watched by anyone who knows their name. At night, I walked along the shore. The sand was cold under my leather boots, and the ocean moved with a steady, indifferent power that made the Reed family's drama feel small. My phone buzzed constantly in my pocket, but I didn't answer. There were texts from the woman I'd loved, missed calls from her father, and a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize that left nothing but the sound of heavy breathing and a distant, muffled argument. I sat on a driftwood log and stared at the dark water. I kept thinking, she knew. She had to have known. And the man she was marrying was so obsessed with the inheritance and the social merger that he had walked right into a trap that wasn't even set for him. By Saturday morning, a new email arrived in the shared account. Subject: clarification regarding test results. The body of the email was a masterpiece of legal hedging, claiming there may have been an error in the chain of custody and that a further review was underway. I forwarded it to the paralegal immediately. Her reply came back within seconds. "They're trying to buy time to fix the narrative. Don't let them." I wasn't going to. I wasn't the man I had been 3 weeks ago, the one who nodded and signed the papers just to make the pain stop. I was starting to see the true shape of the building, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to let it fall. Resuming from, I was starting to see the true shape of the building, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to let it fall. The Wilmington Inn was a relic of a different era, a 2-story weatherboard building that felt like it was held together by layers of white paint and the stubbornness of the Atlantic breeze. My room was small, dominated by a queen-size bed with a handmade quilt that smelled faintly of sun-dried linens and ocean salt. I spent most of Saturday morning just sitting on the balcony, a narrow strip of painted wood that overlooked the dunes. I watched the oats bend in the wind and the seagulls circle above the surf, their cries sharp and lonely against the steady roar of the water. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of the Reed family expectations didn't feel like it was sitting on my chest. I wasn't an architect trying to fix a leaning marriage anymore. I was just a man in a North Carolina beach town, watching the tide come in. I spent hours watching the people on the beach. An older couple walked past every morning around 8 a.m., moving slowly, their hands occasionally brushing against each other as they navigated the damp sand. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. They just existed in the same space, comfortable in a silence that didn't feel like a weapon. I remember thinking that I had spent 12 years trying to manufacture that kind of peace, believing that if I just worked harder, designed a better house, or earned a higher senior architect salary, I could buy us into that version of happiness. But you can't build a permanent structure on a sinkhole, no matter how much structural steel you use. And I think most of us know that feeling, the one where you keep adding more and more to a relationship, hoping the extra weight will finally make it stable, when deep down, you already know the foundation was never poured correctly. That's the quiet tragedy of trying to save something that doesn't want to be saved. You end up becoming a placeholder in your own life. I walked down to a small diner near the boardwalk for lunch, a place with fluorescent lighting and laminate menus that had seen better decades. I ordered fried shrimp and sweet tea, eating slowly while the local news played on a small TV mounted above the counter. They were talking about a tropical depression forming off the coast, a distant threat that didn't seem to bother the regulars. I felt a strange kinship with the storm, something massive and inevitable moving toward a shore that wasn't ready for it. My phone stayed in my pocket, though I could feel it vibrating every few minutes. I knew it was the paralegal, Elise Drummond, or perhaps the woman who was supposed to be saying "I do" in a Charlotte chapel right about now. I thought back to our wedding 10 years ago. It had been a massive affair at the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, orchestrated entirely by my mother-in-law, Eleanor. I remember standing at the altar in a custom tuxedo, feeling like an extra in someone else's movie. My wife had looked beautiful, a vision in ivory lace, but even then, her eyes were always scanning the room, checking to see if the right people were watching. We had spent our entire marriage performing for an audience that didn't actually care about us, only about the Reed family brand. I realized then that my $3 million payout wasn't just for the divorce. It was a severance package for a role I was no longer required to play. The miracle pregnancy had provided the heirs the family needed, and since I wasn't the one who could provide them, I had become an obsolete asset. That afternoon, I sat on a weathered bench near the pier, letting the sun warm my face. I thought about the man who was currently standing in my place, Owen Hale. I didn't hate him. In a way, I felt a twisted sense of pity for the hedge fund manager. He thought he was winning a prize, a socialite wife, and a ready-made family to cement his legacy in the Queen City. He didn't realize he was just the next structural support being swapped into a building that was already on fire. He was a mirror of the man I used to be, ambitious, trusting, and completely blind to the fact that the lawyer, Caleb Novak, was the one holding the match. My phone rang again, and this time, the caller ID showed a 919 area code I didn't recognize. I answered it, expecting another legal threat or a panic plea from the Reeds. "Jax Mercer?" a man's voice asked. It was quiet, filtered through the rustle of wind and what sounded like hospital hallway noise. "Speaking," I said, leaning back against the rough wood of the bench. "My name is Liam Carter," he said, and I felt a jolt of recognition. He was a diagnostic researcher at the medical group where my wife had her prenatal work done. "I shouldn't be calling you. This is a massive violation of protocol, but I've been following the news about the Reed family, and I saw your name on the outdated emergency contact for the DNA lab." I didn't say anything. I just watched a shrimp boat heading out toward the horizon, the black nets draped like mourning veils over its sides. "Someone very powerful pushed for that test to be rushed, Mr. Mercer," the witness continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Off the books rushed. They didn't want the standard chain of custody. They wanted a specific answer, and they wanted it before the wedding rehearsal." I saw the original data entry. The man who brought the samples in. "He wasn't the groom." "I know," I said softly. "No," the man replied, and I could hear the fear in his voice. "You don't understand. It wasn't just about the results. It was about the signature on the authorization form. It was the family's own attorney who signed off as the proxy." I think he was more than just a lawyer in that room. The line went silent for a moment, the only sound being the distant crash of the waves. I didn't feel shocked. I felt the final piece of the blueprint click into place. The motive wasn't just about my wife's affair. It was about the lawyer, Caleb Novak, and his long-term plan to weave himself into the very fabric of the Reed family estate. He wasn't just protecting their reputation, he was protecting his own investment. "Why are you telling me this, Liam?" I asked. "Because I have a daughter," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "And I'd want someone to tell the truth if it were me. They're going to try to bury this, Mr. Mercer. They're already talking about lab errors and unreliable samples. But the data doesn't lie. Only people do." He hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat there for a long time, the sweet tea long gone, the ice melted into a watery pool at the bottom of the plastic cup. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I wasn't just a man who had been cheated on. I was a man who had been used as a human shield for a corporate takeover of a family. The $3 million was a drop in the bucket compared to what the lawyer stood to gain by fathering the next generation of the Reed fortune. I stood up and started walking back toward the inn. The tropical depression was moving closer, the sky turning a dark, ominous gray over the Cape Fear River. I wasn't going to hide in this coastal town anymore. I was going to go back to Charlotte, not for revenge, but for the truth. I needed to see the building fall, and I needed to make sure that when it did, the right people were left standing in the rubble. The drive from the coast back to Charlotte was a 4-hour descent into a reality I wasn't sure I was ready to inhabit. I watched the scrub pines of eastern North Carolina give way to the rolling hills of the Piedmont, the sky ahead of me bruised and heavy with the weight of the coming storm. I stayed in the right lane, keeping my speed steady, my hands locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel of my Toyota. I felt like a senior architect returning to a site where the structural failure was no longer a theory, but a physical certainty. I kept thinking about Caleb Novak, the managing partner who had sat across from me in his office on Tryon Street just 6 months ago. He had offered me a glass of 20-year-old scotch and spent nearly an hour asking about the structural integrity of my latest project at the university, his voice warm and paternal as he told me I was exactly the kind of man the Reed family needed: steady, reliable, and patient. I had actually believed he was looking out for my interests, and that memory felt like a physical weight in my stomach as I pulled into the Queen City. I didn't go to the Reed estate or my old office. Instead, I headed toward a weathered diner on Route 9 near Gastonia, a place where the neon sign buzzed with a dying energy and the smell of bacon grease had been baked into the walls since the 70s. It was 6:58 a.m. when I pushed through the heavy glass door, the bell above it ringing with a sharp, lonely sound. I chose a booth near the back, my back to the wall, and ordered a black coffee that tasted like burnt beans and old copper. At 7:03, a man in a plain windbreaker and a Charlotte Knights baseball cap slid into the seat across from me. It was Liam Carter, the diagnostic researcher who had risked everything to call me. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days, his eyes darting toward the entrance every time the door swung open. "I can't stay long," the witness whispered, his hands trembling as he set a small digital recorder on the laminate table. "I shouldn't even be here, but I couldn't live with the silence after I saw the lab results from Winston-Salem. They told us it was a priority case for the Reed Trust, something that required discretionary handling. I thought it was just the usual wealthy family drama until I realized who was actually pulling the strings." He didn't wait for me to speak. He just pushed the device toward me and hit play. The voice that filled the space between us was unmistakable, calm, cultured, and perfectly modulated. It was the lawyer, Caleb Novak. "You understand this needs to be settled before the ceremony at the Duke Mansion. the lawyer said in the recording, his voice like chilled silk. There's too much at stake with the Reed family estate to let biological timing interfere with the transition. A woman's voice followed, thin and terrified. The woman I had married, Sophia Reed. But the results, she whispered. If Owen sees that the timeline doesn't match, if the DNA doesn't point to him, he'll walk away from the merger. There was a long pause, the sound of a heavy gold lighter clicking open. Don't be naive, Sophia, the lawyer replied smoothly. The twins are mine, and we are not going to destroy a multi-million-dollar legacy over a matter of biology. I've already drafted the NDA for Jax. He'll sign, he'll take the money, and he'll be gone before the first ultrasound is even filed. My chest went cold, a physical sensation like someone had opened a window inside my lungs and let the winter air in. I sat there thinking, he didn't just facilitate the affair, he engineered the entire collapse of my life to ensure his own bloodline would inherit the Reed fortune. He had stood in my kitchen, drank my wine, and looked at my fertility documents while planning to replace me. I kept waiting for my wife to stop him in the recording, waiting for her to say that she couldn't do this to me, but all I heard was the sound of her exhaling, a quiet, defeated surrender to the man who was now holding both her and her family's future in his hands. I have to stop here for a second. Has someone ever taken something from you that wasn't theirs to take, something like your dignity or your future? You don't have to share the whole story, just a heart below if you've been there. You are not alone. And then came the recording, the one that changed everything. I sat there in that Route 9 diner while the world outside continued to move, trucks rumbling toward the South Carolina border, a waitress refilling a sugar shaker, the morning sun hitting the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. I didn't feel rage. I felt a terrifying, crystalline sense of purpose. This wasn't just a betrayal of a marriage. It was a corporate heist using human lives as capital. The lawyer had used my own biological struggle as a weapon, ensuring I was the safe husband who could be easily discarded once the real heir was planted. There's more, Liam Carter said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. He didn't just sign the proxy forms. He's been moving Reed Trust assets into offshore accounts managed by his firm for months. He's not just the father, Mr. Mercer. He's the architect of the family's total financial dependence on him. If that wedding with Owen Hale had happened, Caleb Novak would have had total control over two of the largest portfolios in Charlotte. I looked at the researcher, a man who had likely just ended his career to hand me this information. "Why did you record him?" I asked. The man gave a humorless laugh, adjusted his baseball cap, and looked at the table. "Because I've seen men like him before. They don't have allies, they only have witnesses." I needed insurance to make sure I didn't end up as the lab error that took the fall for his Winston-Salem manipulation. He stood up quickly, dropping a $5 bill for his untouched coffee, and disappeared into the gray morning without looking back. I stayed in the booth for another 10 minutes, letting the burnt coffee grow cold. I sent the audio file to the paralegal, Elise Drummond, with a single word: evidence. Her response was a text that came back in less than a minute. "Do not confront him, not yet. This is bigger than a divorce. This is criminal fraud. Get to my office in Midwood now." I stood up and walked out to my car. I didn't feel like the man who had been handed a $3 million check 3 weeks ago. I felt like the man who was about to take the entire building down. The lawyer thought he had silenced me with a confidentiality clause and a payout, but he had forgotten one thing about structural engineers. We know exactly where the load-bearing walls are, and I was about to pull the primary support out from under the Reed name. I drove toward the Midwood district of Charlotte, a neighborhood where the bungalows are painted in earth tones and the willow oaks form a canopy that filters the North Carolina sun into something soft and deceptive. My senior litigation paralegal, Elise Drummond, was waiting for me in her office, a space that smelled of brewed coffee and laser printer toner, far removed from the polished marble and mahogany of the Reed family inner circle. She didn't offer a greeting when I walked in. She just reached for the digital recorder I had placed on her desk, her expression tightening into a mask of professional neutrality as the recording of Caleb Novak filled the room. We sat in silence for a long time after the audio stopped, the only sound being the distant hum of a delivery truck out on Central Avenue. Elise took off her glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose, and looked at me with a level of pity I hadn't asked for. "They didn't just break your marriage, Jax," she said quietly. "They tried to rewrite your entire history to fit into a tax-advantaged estate plan." We spent the next 3 hours assembling the structural report of the Reed family's collapse. We organized the wire transfer receipts from Wells Fargo, the Raleigh fertility records, the Winston-Salem lab logs, and the audio file into a series of cloud-synced folders that were mirrored across 4 different secure servers. Elise worked with a surgical precision, drafting a formal demand for a non-adversarial meeting that was worded with enough legal weight to make a man like Caleb Novak sweat through his custom-tailored shirt. We weren't asking for more money, and we weren't looking for a settlement. We were providing them with an invitation to witness the demolition of their own lies. The meeting was set for the following morning at the lawyer's office on Tryon Street, a glass-walled skyscraper that overlooked the uptown skyline like a monument to the very power I was about to challenge. I sat in the parking deck for 5 minutes before going up, just watching a valet park a black Cadillac with the kind of practiced ease that only comes from handling things that don't belong to you. The sun was hot against the windshield, and for a second, the world felt completely normal, like I was just another professional arriving for a mid-morning meeting to discuss blueprints or zoning laws. I think I wanted to believe that one more time before the world I had known for 12 years was finally leveled to the ground. I stood in the elevator as it ascended to the 40th floor, watching the numbers climb with a steady, mechanical indifference. I kept waiting for my heart to race, for the adrenaline to kick in and make my hands shake, but it wouldn't. I stood there thinking, if I open this door and play this recording, there is no way back to the person I was before this morning. I was choosing a devastating truth over a $3 million piece, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a victim of the Reed family legacy. I felt like the only person in the building who wasn't lying to themselves. When the doors opened, the receptionist, a woman who had known my name for a decade, didn't smile. She just gestured toward the main conference room, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the kind of tension that makes your skin crawl. Inside, the Reed family was already seated. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, was at the head of the table, her posture so rigid she looked like she was carved from Appalachian stone. My wife, Sophia, sat to her right, her eyes red and her designer suit slightly wrinkled, a rare lapse in her carefully curated armor. And there, at the other end of the table, sat the man who had drafted my divorce and fathered her children, Caleb Novak. He looked perfectly composed, his fingers steepled, his expression one of mild professional boredom. Beside him sat Owen Hale, the hedge fund manager who had been the intended groom. He looked smaller than I remembered, his face drained of color, staring at the mahogany tabletop like it was a ledge he was about to fall from. "Thank you for coming, Jax," the lawyer said, his voice as smooth and dangerous as black ice on a mountain road. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding the DNA results and your previous agreement. We've prepared an updated NDA with significantly enhanced compensation to reflect the unique stresses of the past week. Let's resolve this quietly, as gentlemen." He slid a leather-bound folder toward me, the weight of it thudding against the table. I didn't touch it. I didn't even look at the numbers. I reached into my messenger bag and pulled out a small Bluetooth speaker, placing it directly in the center of the table. I didn't look at my mother-in-law, and I didn't look at the woman I had once loved. I looked directly at the lawyer, the man who thought he could buy my silence with the very money he was planning to steal from the family he had infiltrated. "I'm not here for a new deal, Caleb," I said, my voice coming out slow and measured, the way I spoke to contractors when a foundation wasn't poured to code. "I'm here to show you exactly how the building is going to fall." I hit play on the iPhone in my hand. the room went so silent that I could hear the mechanical click of the clock on the wall. The recording of Caleb Novak's voice filled the glass-walled room, loud and undeniable, detailing the affair, the paternity of the twins, and his plan to use the Reed Trust as his personal offshore bank. As the audio played, I watched the lawyer's composure disintegrate. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow-motion collapse. First, the steepled fingers dropped. Then, a vein in his temple began to throb. Finally, his eyes darted toward the door, the calculation of a predator who realized the cage was finally locked. My wife let out a sharp, ragged sob and buried her face in her hands. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, turned to look at the lawyer with an expression of such pure, cold fury that it seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 20 degrees. But it was Owen Hale who reacted the most violently. The mirror of my own former life stood up so abruptly, his chair flipped backward, hitting the carpet with a muffled thud. He didn't say a word to me. He just looked at the lawyer with the realization that he had nearly married into a social suicide pact. "This is coercion," the lawyer hissed, his voice finally losing its silk. "That recording is inadmissible, Jax. You're violating every clause of the NDA you signed at the courthouse." "I don't care about the NDA," I replied, leaning forward until I was only inches from his face. "And neither will the North Carolina State Bar when they see the fraud you've committed against your own clients. This isn't about the money anymore. It's about the fact that you thought you could build a legacy on top of my life and expect me to hold up the floorboards." I stood up, gathered my things, and looked at the woman who had been my wife. She looked up at me, her face a mask of shame, but I didn't feel the need to hear her apology. The truth was finally in the room, and it was the loudest thing any of us had ever heard. I walked out of that Charlotte skyscraper into the humid afternoon air. The tropical depression had finally reached the Piedmont, and the first heavy drops of rain were hitting the hot asphalt of Tryon Street, creating a thick, white mist that smelled of wet stone and exhaust. I didn't look back at the glass tower. I just walked to my Toyota, sat in the driver's seat, and listened to the rain hammer against the metal roof. It was the first time in my life I didn't feel like I was waiting for a building to collapse. Before I tell you what happened to the man who tried to engineer my life, what does justice look like to you here? Drop it below. Then tell me, was what actually happened enough? What came next was something nobody expected, not even the lawyer. The North Carolina State Bar opened a formal investigation into Caleb Novak 3 weeks later, leading to his immediate disbarment for fiduciary fraud and witness intimidation. The Reed family was forced to liquidate several real estate holdings in Myers Park to settle the civil lawsuits filed by the Hale family and the private investors who had been caught in the crossfire. My ex-wife, Sophia, eventually left Charlotte altogether, moving to a small town in South Carolina to raise her children away from the public shame of her parents' legacy. The $3 million sat in my Wells Fargo account for months until I transferred the majority of it to a nonprofit legal clinic that protects individuals from corporate legal abuse. I didn't need their money to build my new life. I just needed the truth. I remember sitting on my new balcony thinking that I had spent a decade ignoring the cracks in my own house because I was too afraid to see the truth underneath. I had been an accomplice in my own silence, choosing the comfort of a lie because I didn't think I deserved anything better. That was my mistake, not hers. I still drive past the Charlotte skyline sometimes, but I just keep going.